This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On April the 24th, the Institute hosted the fourth in its series of annual conferences on themes in defense and security studies. This year's conference focused on global challenges to Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic.
We'll start off with Lieutenant Commander Mike Bielby. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, so Mike Bielby worked for Canadian Joint Operations Command as the, new job title, so Continental Surveillance and Control. So ultimately I oversee our domestic surveillance control plan, assertion of sovereignty on behalf of the Crown. Ultimately though, given the provinces, territories, and their responsibilities and what we have in NORAD, 95% of what I do is maritime domain awareness, maritime approaches to North America, and even then, really more of the Arctic. If I want to really be more specific, let's just talk about the Davis Strait, because in order to get to our Arctic, you're either coming across the top of Alaska, or you're coming around the tip of Greenland into Davis Strait. So most of what I'm doing is Davis Strait into the Northwest Passage. So we'll get to that in a second. So I probably should have stolen that other slide with the Arctic shipping routes, because that would better represent what I'm going to talk about. But this one that stole from my Coast Guard will also work. So in 2017, in the Northwest Passage, we saw 191 vessels making 385 voyages. 39 of those transited the entirety of the Northwest Passage.
Commander Bielby noted further that in 2018, 185 vessels made 395 voyages in the Northwest Passage, while 5 vessels sailed through the passage, representing a 3.1% decrease in the number of vessels from 2017, and a 2.6% increase in number of voyages from 2017. The decrease in 2018 traffic is directly attributed to severe ice conditions, but the 5-year trend is upwards. On the other hand, on the Northern Sea Route in 2017, 283 vessels made 1,908 voyages, while 27 vessels passed through the NSR, representing a 5% decrease in the number of vessels from 2016, but a 12% increase in the number of voyages from 2016. In 2018, 384 vessels conducted voyages in the NSR, and 59 passed through the NSR. This is a 35% increase in the number of vessels from 2017, but significantly, a 120% increase in the number of transits through the NSR. These numbers, Commander Bielby emphasized, represent the known knowns. Vessels greater than 300 tons and/or broadcasting on AIS. They do not represent the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns. Even more important than what these numbers represent are the security challenges they highlight, as this data is derived almost exclusively from AIS. There are a number of security challenges in the Arctic maritime domain, including but not limited to a lack of persistent sensors, a lack of diversity in those sensors, which is to say active versus passive, and the problem that no one sensor capability is infallible, which means a system of systems approach is required. There is also a lack of federal footprint and infrastructure in the area. There are problems with information passage. In the high latitudes, there is poor cell coverage, and SATCOM is problematic above 65 degrees north. Russia gets around this by placing its satellites in a highly elliptical Monia orbit, which is something that Canada is looking at in the midterm range. These challenges notwithstanding, Commander Bielby argues that the two greatest Arctic security challenges in the maritime domain are dark targets and those bad actors operating in the interstitial gray areas. In slide 3, the distance from the intersection of the axes reflects decreasing urgency and severity. Highest threats are dark targets, tracking in theater, lack of local situational awareness, and lack of reliable means of communication and information sharing. This threat matrix was the product of a Canos conference held in 2017, led by the Center for Resilient Communities at the University of Idaho, the National Maritime Intelligence Integration Office, and Commander Bielby. Using modified Delphi and nominal group Pareto dot methodology, they were able to systematically elicit the most severe emerging security threats from a group of 85 security and intelligence professionals representing over 35 Canadian and U.S. federal and state or provincial agencies, and rank them by priority. As we see from the matrix, dark targets were assessed to pose the greatest security challenge in the Arctic. To borrow from and paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, these dark targets represent the known unknowns. We know that the vessel is there because of detection by active sensors, but we don't know who they are or what they're doing because they're not radiating in the RF spectrum. And the unknown unknowns. We don't know what we don't know because we have zero detections and they have zero emissions. Commander Bielby argues that the even bigger challenge to national security are those bad actors operating in the interstitial gray areas, due to, first of all, a lack of local situational awareness, knowing what is normal in that area because most government services are managed in the south, issues with communication at higher latitudes, system incompatibility and no satellite downlink at the higher latitudes. Information sharing, barriers to information sharing because there are no existent memoranda of understanding or other legal authorities to share. There is departmental and cultural reticence to share. There is a lack of overarching government department directive authority providing a cohesive and unified vision of national interests. There are deficiencies in interagency policy, departmental policies, or interpretation of policy. These security threats all enable transnational organized crime and foreign nations operating asymmetrically to exploit the interstitial gray areas and act against the Canadian national interest. In theory, the Marine Security Operations Centres should overcome the issues of info sharing and interdepartmental policy as they encompass 6 federal departments with the greatest marine equities working together toward a common purpose. The reality, though, is that amongst the MSOC member departments, there's no common agreement with regard to the MSOC's mandate, and even within the same department, that common agreement can be absent. In conclusion, Commander Bielby noted that if the trend of lower ice conditions and faster seasonal ice melt continues, then it's fair to assume that Arctic maritime traffic will continue to increase. It's also fair to assume that should our ability to maintain situational awareness in the Arctic, both from a technological and from a policy legislative perspective, not keep pace, then our security challenges in the Arctic will continue to grow at an exponential rate. Despite the prevalence of the Arctic in current federal policy, it is not reasonable to expect the huge influx of resources necessary to rectify any shortcomings caused by current sensor capability or lack of federal footprint. The key to mitigating these security challenges is improved collaboration among government entities at the federal, state or provincial, local, tribal, territorial, and partner levels. The sharing of information is not enough, though. The nature of what's being shared and the forum in which it's being shared are just as important, if not more so. The adversary needs to be denied the ability to operate in the gaps and seams between departmental mandates. This could be done through a variety of means. A centralized strategy, while probably ensuring the most cohesive government approach, is probably also the least likely to occur. A much more attainable solution is for an entity like the MSOC to collate every instance of anomalous maritime behavior in the Arctic, no matter how innocuous, whether it's reports of pinging in the Hecla and Fury Strait, marine scientific research applications that just don't seem right, or an increase in large-scale investments in certain sectors of the Arctic that don't make economic sense. This data needs to be collated, analyzed for patterns, and a heat map generated that would then be correlated to critical infrastructure, mineral deposits, etc. This heat map would then allow government entities to task resources to those areas with a higher probability of anomalous behavior, and thereby deny bad actors the gaps and seams to hide in.
And thank you everyone for coming. So today I'm going to start off by mentioning something that shouldn't be controversial, that the Arctic, specifically strategically speaking, has been one of the most stable regions in the post-Cold War era. This includes a thinner version of stability where there's been a lack of war and conflict and confrontation, but also a thicker version of stability in terms of this increasing institutionalized landscape between all Arctic and increasingly non-Arctic countries and actors to work on a wide variety of cooperative measures tackling a whole host of regional issues. Whether this will continue or not is increasingly being debated amongst academics and in the media and in the public writ large. And this is largely because, as Bob Ray mentioned, the region is going through profound change. And I'm just going to highlight three kind of super trends that I think are accelerating, and their linkages are becoming more tethered together. One is that the region is becoming more accessible to a wide variety of human activities, everything from military operations to economic development, shipping and tourism. It's becoming more heterogeneous in the numbers and types of actors that are interested in operating there, everything from communities to NGOs to private commercial actors to non-state actors, particularly from Asia. Or correction, external actors from Asia. And as well, we have this more interconnectivity. So the region is becoming more embedded within global networks, forces, and processes. And here, again, specifically looking at a strategic level, we're seeing a world which is becoming increasingly defined by major power competition, particularly between China, Russia, and the United States. And here, I think what we're seeing is not moves towards revolutionary revisionism by any of them, but rather an ability to try to gain greater degrees of freedom to reconstitute external relations to their advantage. And so there's this tension between being really tethered and embedded within these interdependent world order, but still trying to carve out these spheres of influence for greater control. And so this leads to the question, what does this mean for Arctic stability, particularly given that Russia, China, and the United States are all increasingly interested and involved in the Arctic, and what does that mean for Canadian Arctic security? So to begin with, there's this emerging debate and continuing debate about what accounts for Arctic stability since the end of the Cold War. And there are roughly kind of two schools of thought. These aren't unified theories, more rough paradigms that kind of explain its condition and whether or not it'll continue moving forward. So the first one is an Arctic conflict school, which largely argues that Arctic stability in the post-Cold War era is largely a function of the region in and of itself being strategically unimportant, specifically to big, large players, which has allowed cooperation to kind of emerge as a condition. But as the region continues to open up and economic and strategic possibilities become more apparent, it'll become a more coveted and contested region between major powers. Juxtapositioning this argument is an Arctic exceptionalism debate that says that since the end of the Cold War, we've seen this increasing mosaic of institutions and norms and values between all Arctic states, including Russia, and increasingly non-Arctic states, on working on a number of issues which are in all of their interests, which then kind of creates a sort of feedback mechanism that furthers the development of a more orderly region, which is in the interest of all states, including big countries with differing strategic interests, to accept and abide by. Here, I think that there's some limitations from both schools. I think Arctic conflict has constantly been saying that the end of the region's stability is coming right now, and so they're having to constantly kick the can down the road as to when the region's going to fall off the precipice. And I think Arctic exceptionalism is largely more of a description of cooperation and not so much an explanation for stability, at least strategically. And I would caution kind of some portrayals that the region has quasi-magical powers that kind of insulate it against geopolitical developments and rivalries elsewhere. So instead, I think that the Arctic at a strategic level and its stability is accounted for what I call a latent balance of power which has emerged which is a background feature which allows for security interests to largely be secured amongst all the Arctic states and allows them to cooperate on more low political issues without interfering with those more higher strategic issues. I think this is based on three factors. The first is the division of authority in the Arctic. So there's no competing territories except for Hans Island between Canada and Denmark. There's none of these lost territories which these major powers are fighting over. Most of the economic surveyed resources are already within well-recognized state and maritime jurisdictions. Yes, there are a number of maritime disputes, as Bob Ray mentioned, but again, this is not over ownership and sovereignty. This is over the balance between sovereign rights of coastal states versus user rights of user states. Second, the strategic alignment. So when we look at the Arctic, it's largely a binary landscape in terms of Russia on one side and the other Western Arctic states, which are all NATO allies, and Finland and Sweden close defense partners. What this allows is there's no kind of swing states to try to convert or change their alignments. It's largely kind of frozen, I guess, to say in a way. But what it does is it allows to kind of go back into a background feature which doesn't allow the use of real coercive action, specifically military force, to change these alignments. And finally, all Arctic states are relatively coherent entities which have functioning governments with lack of civil wars and internal strife which other countries could try to inflame or use to their advantage. And so I think what's really happened is this produces a condition where there isn't a lot of competition over hegemony of the Arctic. So even a major power like Russia, which materially would be seen as a hegemon in the region, given its land, its coastline, population, resources, but it doesn't strive to control the region. And I think that's because this latent balance of power kind of secures a lot of these security interests, or has in the last number of decades. And furthermore, it's allowed for more cross-cutting specific issue alignments to happen in the Arctic, which make for avoiding easy geopolitical divisions writ large. So for example, Canada and Russia have a number of interests in the Arctic which are aligned, including justifications of control and management of waterways along their coastlines, and as well some degrees of wariness of external actors' involvement in the Arctic, whereas countries like China and the United States are in a way almost having a convergence of interest over ensuring freedom of navigation, although differing viewpoints about what is included in freedom of navigation in the Arctic. And I think this is kind of another important stabilizing product and feature. So looking at this kind of latent balance of power and assessing kind of strategic challenges which come about, and I think just a point that I kind of forgot on the other slide is that this Arctic conflict, Arctic exceptionalism debate really sometimes goes down to whether or not major power competition is going to manifest in the region, and I think it's more of a question of how it's going to manifest and how does it interact with the underlying stability functions and features that I already mentioned. And here in the literature, we largely look at major powers in terms of threat and challenges. Russia, unsurprisingly, largely dominates this debate and has. And here there's an acceptance that Russia is abiding by rules, regulations, participating in the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, both in terms of its acceptance of it being a maritime regime which applies to the Arctic, but also using mechanisms to forward its continental shelf claims. But there's always this concern that it may decide to change towards this revisionist path, which we've seen in other regions. And so there's this big debate about what is the Russian military buildup in the Arctic for? Is it precautionary and defensive, or is it preemptive and more aggressive? And I think here it largely boils down to how you assume they're going to achieve their strategic interests. Russia wants to have control over economic resources in their littorals and also develop a defense in depth strategy given the receding sea ice and kind of threats to their bastion strategies related to their submarine nuclear deterrent and ability to project force from their northern forces to other regions. China is increasingly entering this debate as well. And here there are concerns that while China talks about win-win cooperation and wanting to kind of tether the region in towards its larger Belt and Road Initiative, specifically through the development of Arctic shipping lanes, which they call Polar Silk Roads, there's been this concern that they may become overbearing economic actors and therefore kind of turn smaller economies like Iceland and Greenland into de facto vassals. And finally, there's also this growing kind of military concern that they may become more active there, particularly their increasing blue water navy. So I think this leads to this discussion about what is the role of NATO in the Arctic. This is happening amongst NATO countries and in Canada, and we're starting to see a shift towards more of a role. Things like exercise trident juncture in Norway, changes in Canadian defense policy language. But here I think there still hasn't been a decisive move as to whether or not the Arctic in and of itself is becoming a more contested region, or whether NATO should be focused on it because it enables Russian power to be projected in other regions like the North Atlantic. Here, though, I think that there is this debate about whether or not the Arctic needs to become a more overt balance of power system, specifically the deployment of military forces and more unity of NATO actors counteracting China and or Russia. But I think that when we look at the threat assessments or challenges about Russia and China, both regionally and globally, we have to be concerned that this doesn't operate in a vacuum, because there's this larger phenomena of major power competition, and that involves the United States. And I think that some things the United States are doing in the Arctic could potentially be a bit troublesome in maintaining stability in the region. One is we're seeing this increasing language and possibilities of conducting freedom of navigation operations. There's only really two targets, that would be Canada, Northwest Passage, or Russia and the Northern Sea Route. For Canada, it would kind of erode relations but wouldn't upend anything. But for Russia, if they attempted to do that, that could really lead to not just degradation of Russia-West relations further, but also kind of upending regional stability writ large, possibly. Another one that we're seeing is the Americans are very concerned about China's economic influence, particularly in the Americas, and we're seeing this happen in the Arctic, where recently we've seen moves for the American pressure on Denmark to provide funding for Danish companies to win contracts in Greenland for airports over their Chinese counterparts. And so what we're seeing is even the United States is increasingly playing this role of potentially trying to create a sphere of influence to minimize Russian military and Chinese economic power and influence, which is kind of seeming into the Arctic. And therefore, kind of moving forward into the mid-century, it's unclear to see whether or not the region is going to become more inward-oriented in terms of looking at this increasingly accessible ocean, or whether it's going to become more outward-oriented, with different parts of the Arctic being more tethered strategically and economically to continental anchor points controlled by major countries. Again, this doesn't mean that the region is going to be peaceful or destabilizing, but it does present some kind of challenges for regional cooperation on a number of issues. I know I'm going over, I'll try to be super quick. Sorry. So in terms of trying to adapt to this changing region where major power competition is interacting with the region and the manifestation of it is uncertain, I think that the Arctic needs to be a strategic priority for Canada, obviously. The only thing I'll say about that is increasingly security and development, these two concepts we use a lot, we need to problematize them a lot more in terms of being a spectrum, and as well looking at them as being tethered together in complex and intricate ways and not dealing with them in a siloed way. There is, and I support, a kind of gradual increase in Canadian military and constabulary forces in the region, both in the exercising of sovereignty and also working with Arctic actors like Greenland, Denmark, and the United States. Here I'd say that the focus needs to be on surveillance, logistics, training, and building Arctic capable forces, but this has to be balanced with the idea of the environmental footprint, the social impacts of increasing military forces there, potentially dual use economic development with private industry to create infrastructure, and as well an avoidance of trying to militarize Arctic policy as if traditional state threats are the only and most important threat. I think major power competition is going to increasingly seep into a lot of these debates, but it shouldn't be taking it over, and the military, specifically kinetically, shouldn't be seen as the only real option. So I think that there's, I'm not going to mention these, but I think there's some specifics we should do against each Russia, China, the United States. But the big one I want to talk about is, just to conclude, is that we are seeing this pressure of major power competition. It's gradually increasing in the Arctic. It's not leading to an upending of the region, but it's also not maintaining its exceptionalism in perpetuity necessarily. And here I think Canada needs to work with other middle powers in trying to constrain moves towards building exclusionary blocks in the Arctic based on strategic rationales. And this will be this tension between trying to keep the Arctic as kind of a regionally coherent entity that works on transnational challenges, particularly within their jurisdictions, but also in increasingly global commons, because the Arctic Ocean is in many ways a global commons. and therefore that requires kind of regional level cooperation. But we're faced with a tension not just between Russia and China, and I think that there are real concerns about them, but also the United States, which may feel this pressure to try to gain more degrees of control over technology, economic developments, and security within their own Arctic region, with kind of unforeseen ramifications so far to regional cooperation moving forward. Thank you.
Charron will now speak to us about Canada, the U.S., and the Arctic.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank the organizers very much. It's always a privilege to be invited to this august body, and so I want to thank you very much. What I want to talk about is going to echo a little bit of what my other two colleagues have mentioned, but I want to look at it from the Canada and U.S. perspective and how they operate in the Arctic. And what, rather than speaking about the tactical challenges, what I want to do is really talk about the strategic challenges. So I have three goals. One is I need to understand what it is we all mean by sovereignty, because it can mean anything to anybody. And if you add a few lawyers in the room, you've just compounded the problem. So what I want to do is try and get to the idea of what does it mean to have a sovereignty concern vis-a-vis the Department of Defense and the U.S. Armed Forces, because that's what I'm limiting my discussion to. I then want to look at, so what are the Arctic challenges? And here I want to emphasize, I want to look at the strategic challenges, because Lieutenant Commander Bielby has talked about the tactical challenges, which the U.S. also has, but we need to look at the strategic ones. And then finally, the responses and the implications. So first, to what do we mean by sovereignty? It always perplexed me that Canada is always the Arctic state that talks about sovereignty crises. No other Arctic state tends to talk about having a sovereignty crisis. And what is more, this sovereignty crisis seems to stem from our closest neighbor and ally. And so we really need to unpack that. And if you look in the Arctic literature, there is lots and lots of articles trying to understand this fascination that Canada has, first of all, with the Arctic, and then the idea that it's going to be taken from us, lost, it's under threat. This is particularly puzzling for the U.S. because since 1938, of course, we've had an agreement to jointly defend North America, and we tend to ignore the fact that for the three NORAD headquarters that we have in Alaska, Canada, and the U.S., the deputy is always the national of the other country. And so on the one hand, we don't think about sovereignty concerns when we clear customs and immigration for the U.S. in a Canadian airport. That's fine. And we can have U.S. deputies who are the deputy JFAC for Canada. That's fine. But all of a sudden, when it comes to the Arctic, or more specifically, the end of the tree line, we have a problem. When we look at all of the actors that are out there and look at the geopolitical landscape, Adam pointed out that we have a number of agreements and some terrific organizations. I mean, the Arctic Council has been absolutely essential to encouraging cooperation in the Arctic, and that has to continue. But we tend to look at actors like China, Singapore, India, and our blood pressure rises, and we tend to assume this means that Canada's Arctic, once again, is in trouble. But we maybe need to think about that. It's again, not a sovereignty issue, but I think it's concerns about how we interpret law differently. I think it's concerns about the classic IR problems of cheaters and defectors, and more importantly, enforcement. Do we have the alliances, the organizations to enforce these laws? But then to the near-peer competitors, and this is new language. And you see this in The Economist, you see this in Foreign Affairs. You have to dust off your deterrence textbooks. Great power politics are back. And we have revisionist powers. And we're talking specifically about Russia and China. China, because of its massive size, its economic capability, but also it has a strategic vision of the world in the belts, one road, sea belt, Silk Road, I always get it backwards. But that idea that every sea lane of communication and road and train and air transit will have the hub in China. And again, this makes us pause. Then with Russia, we see activity in Ukraine, Crimea. We see the fact that Russia has been able to poison individuals in the United Kingdom, seemingly without consequence. And again, this is really concerning. Above all of this, though, I think, is climate change. But the Department of Defense and the U.S. Armed Forces have a limit to what they can do with climate change. So we need to be able to operationalize for them what should you be worrying about. Well, they have. Both have decided that they are particularly concerned about these near-peer competitors. But note, it is not because the Arctic is a theater of operation similar to the Cold War. It is because the Arctic is the throughway. And the most common scenario is that something happens, a miscalculation, a misunderstanding in especially Russia's near abroad, and to detract attention from that, there's a strike or using the Arctic as a throughway to put pressure off of that near abroad. The problem for Canada, again here, and this is where the sovereignty concerns rise, is that we have very different levels of capabilities, and in both countries, very different levels of frankness about the problems of China and Russia. Canada rarely has conversations about their concerns about these two states that doesn't then stray into other issue areas. And it's almost like an allergic reaction to try and figure out exactly what are their intentions. We understand their capabilities, but it's their intentions ultimately which we have no agreement on what to expect. Thankfully, of course, for Canada and the US, we have NORAD. It is reflexively pointed to as the hallmark of Canada-US relations, even though nobody understands really what they do, nor studies it. The only people who study NORAD are Canadians, and there are, I think, 2.5 of us. In US documents, NORAD is never referred to, but things are changing, and they're changing in interesting ways that I think we all need to pay attention to. First of all, successive NORAD commanders have been jumping up and down to say, we have concerns about these near-peer competitors. They've changed the language from talking about going after arrows to archers. Very different language. But the real opportunity for Canada is we have the first ever Canadian-born NORAD commander. And so all our hopes are that we now have in one individual who has always had the ability, in fact, the responsibility, the mandate to reach to the highest level of governments to say, we have a problem and we need to react. We now have a Canadian-born NORAD commander, which might offset the big elephant in the room, which is the US NORTHCOM. Now, Adam mentioned NATO in the Arctic, and I would say for both Canada and the US, we are very hesitant to have NATO have any kind of activity in the Arctic as NATO, in the North American Arctic. We are going to continue to prefer one-off partners, so invite Denmark, invite Norway, invite the US. But the thought of having NATO operating in the North American Arctic really fills me with dread and doom for a whole bunch of reasons that have nothing to do with the alliance, but moreover, what is that sort of impression of having NATO operating in historic internal waters? That would be like saying, NATO, come and have an exercise in Lake Winnipeg, because we're concerned. We have to think about those kind of strategic messaging when it comes to Russia and China. Now, NATO does think that there is a concern, but it's the North Atlantic, and it's this famous Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which used to have a dedicated position in NATO called the Saklant position that would strategically exercise that area and make sure that we had an understanding of who were using those sea lanes of communication and whether or not we had proper surveillance. After the Cold War, we lost that position, and we're starting to realize it has to come back. But the other strategic problem that NATO is starting to realize is that we have a number of seams and gaps, and these come to our challenges. We need to be able to figure these out. So to paraphrase Winston Churchill, gentlemen and women, of course, we are out of money. Now is the time to think. And that is the problem. We are up against Russia and China that have endless amounts of budgets, mostly because they don't need to make choices that democratic countries need to, like, do we have enough money for education and hospital care and things like that. And so we're dealing with two peer competitors that can outspend us. We're very good, Canada and US, at exercising tactically. We do that seamlessly. You seriously cannot see the difference between a Canadian and a US personnel when they're working together. And that's mostly because we're also embedded in each other's militaries, but because we speak the same language, we do the same exercises. What we need to do now is do strategic exercises. We're also very concerned about the all-domain awareness, and Lieutenant Commander Bielby talked about that. Can we talk to each other? Do we know what's going on? What do we do with those unknown unknowns? And we also have to be worried about the disconnect between Canadian and the US at federal levels concerning causes of climate change, which are very different at the state and territorial level. The good news is the fraternity and the sorority of the uniform seem to hover above all the political machinations. And I think it's why often it is best that maybe President Trump doesn't fully understand the integration of NORAD and NATO. But here's where I think you're going to see more attention for both NATO and NORAD, and that's because you see on this map, you see the geographic combatant command structure of the US, which divides the world regionally. And then, of course, you have NATO areas of operation, you have NORAD areas of operation, you have CJOC, US Northcom. All of these have seams and gaps. And we've sort of taken it for granted that, well, you're following that area and you're covering that, right? And we're all of a sudden realizing, well, maybe not. And this is why Trident Juncture was very much a strategic exercise with an Article 5 element to see, are we thinking the big picture? The response by Canada so far has been things like, we need to align our Canadian Air Defence Identification Zone. We need to be able to look further out in time and space so that we have some advanced warning. We desperately need to upgrade our North Warning system. But you note that in our latest defense policy and successive defense policies, we have earmarked exactly $0 to this upgrade. And the assumption is that things like aligning the KDIS doesn't cost us any money. Likewise, NORAD is considering new command and control scenarios, including a dedicated commander down in Tyndall, Florida, which was washed out, to help centralize command and control, and also look at new ways to improve surveillance and domain awareness, except for, once again, we have no money, and we're not quite sure how we're going to achieve that, given that we have two peer competitors that are ready to outspend us. So I don't want to be alarmist. There's lots that Canada and the US does very, very well, and NATO is doing with our allies. And the one thing I think we're doing very well is that we're very careful about the changes we make. We are always very cognizant of the message it will send to Russia and China. And we are always looking to engage them in these other areas, especially the Arctic Council. And we look forward to a new chairperson that's coming in May. But I think for Canadians, what it does mean is that we need to start thinking about what it means when we say sovereignty is at risk. Because we often turn to the Department of Defense to say, and you do something. But the Department of Defense, in every case in the Arctic, is a supporting role. So we need to start operationalizing, stop using the language of sovereignty, and actually start putting words on what it is that we need changed. Are we concerned about enforcement of international laws? Are we concerned we are not able to communicate with Russia and China? Are we concerned about not understanding intentions? That, I think, will be far more productive in the long run than talking about a loss of sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we've got at least 15 minutes for questions. That'll put us right back on schedule. So when you ask a question, please come to one of the microphones. I know there's more than one. I can only see one. And
There's another
so,
one here.
who has the first question?
I'd like to address this to the full panel, and it's just I want to mention a series of things which kind of give an overall impression of our seriousness about defending our north. One is our northernmost military establishment is alert, I believe, and for personnel who are deployed to alert here in Canada, I don't know if it's still being done, but it was being done, a bar was issued to the General Service Medal. Imagine that, a bar that's normally awarded for participating in a battle or a dangerous assignment is given for just being stationed in Canada. For search and rescue in the high Arctic, the search and rescue technicians and their aircraft would have to come from Cold Lake, Alberta or Greenwood, Nova Scotia, not anywhere located in the far north. I believe it is at Nanisivik that it was agreed that a runway would be extended to take all military aircraft as opposed to the short takeoff and landing runway that was there. And it was indeed built, but it has since fallen into a state of disrepair and can't be used. This past winter, there was an Army exercise in the far north, and a number of the soldiers suffered serious frostbite and had to be extracted by the Canadian Rangers. The Royal Canadian Navy, with its new vessels of the Harry DeWolf class, the offshore Arctic patrol vessels, they can't really be classed as warships, although they do have provision for a 20-millimeter cannon on the front, although I've heard people laughingly refer to it as a Nerf gun. And it can't really be called an icebreaker because it has some capacity for maneuvering in ice, but not year-round. There are about a 3-month period where it simply can't operate there. So it's neither of those things. It's more or less a showing of the flag. And with all these examples I've given, I sort of want to wind it around with what I charitably call the pathetic process of Canadian defense equipment procurement. And I wonder if you could comment on that for me, please.
I'm not stepping on that one.
Okay, so to be fair to a public servant who can neither confirm nor deny the fact that procurement is done in a mishmash fashion in Canada, that is one of the problem. But many of the examples you brought suggest that we need more military in the Arctic, and maybe we need to think about that. If the military is always in a supporting role, and they are a very expensive department, are they the ones that really should be providing more assets there? I think the one thing that the new Harry DeWolf class ship is showing is that Canada has embraced the whole of government approach in the Arctic because we have to. One, we only have 120,000 people living in 40% of our landmass. So it's not possible, that cost element that Bob Ray talked about is very, very real. But what we are looking for is the whole of government approach, which is best seen in this ship, because it's not just a defense issue. In fact, the defense issue is the bottom of the list. It's other issues that need to be addressed. It's support for things like policing and needing more social workers, and making sure that we have immigration and transportation and ICE services and all of those other departments up there. So a call for more defense isn't necessarily going to help us with many of the problems we have up there, for which the Department of Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces just simply doesn't have the mandate to oversee.
Yeah, so I am going to kind of piggyback off of that and just say that I think in a lot of ways, a lot of operations, particularly that the Navy does in the high Arctic in Canada, is almost like an expeditionary operation because of the lack of logistics and experience in the region. I think that you are going to see this gradual augmentation across the board of constabulary agencies operating and having a presence there. But I would say two things. One is that I think I agree with Andrea that it should not lead to kind of a militarization of Arctic policy, even though security issues and concerns need to be embedded within all levels of decision making about the Arctic, particularly its development. So things like potentially like joint projects on infrastructure. So I think NanoCivic has potentially shown the limitations of a government-made Navy-only use port there, when in fact we could probably leverage other existing or being built facilities there. But again, that leads to very complicated issues of working with territories and communities and private entities. But I do think that that is something we should be looking at. It's also something that the Russians are doing. On that point, I think when I was talking about this Latin balance of power, and some people are like, this just sounds like a balance of power. But to me, like, balance of power from an international relations perspective is usually about, well, how many icebreakers does that country have? Or how many troops are on the Kola Peninsula? And how many warships are there? And I think there's two issues. One is that the Arctic, in the Eurasian Arctic, is a far different operating environment for Russia than the high Arctic for Canada. It's different climate, geography. There's like 2 million Russians who live north of the Arctic Circle. It's their industrial heartland. And also, Russian geography faces north predominantly. Like, its coastline is almost predominantly north. And that's where it has a lot of its nuclear and military power, which it likes to maintain the ability to deploy into other regions. And I think that if we're always going to compare ourselves to what Russia or even Norway has, again, Norway is a northern-oriented country, we're always going to be disappointed because they have more troops and more icebreakers than we do. But I don't think that there's an equivalence there that needs to be maintained. And really, I think there should be more investigation as to, well, what does Denmark have in Greenland and the Faroe Islands, as maybe a bit more of a realistic comparison there. And again, I like this idea that Andrea mentioned about sovereignty as including a whole bunch of things, particularly in the north, about things like presence, the exercising of it, and defending it. And I think that the defending part is probably what the military is designed for, and probably where it feels the most comfortable. But the challenges in a lot of ways are not really that different from decades ago. Like, we still face a strategic challenge in the nuclear deterrence realm with Russia, and even though they're building faster hypersonic missiles, it still doesn't fundamentally change that mission set. But I think it's more about the idea of sovereignty as building strong communities that are sustainable and that don't need to have a kind of a military first orientation. And I think when we're talking about these near-peer competitors, I see that Russia presents a military challenge that doesn't need to have large in-theater combat capability to counteract. And I think China is more of a geoeconomic issue than a geopolitical military issue at this point, and therefore kind of rushing more troops and equipment and soldiers up there is not going to really solve or mitigate that challenge.
So, as you know, with 475 days until I retire, I'm not going to speak on defense procurement. I'm going to avoid that landmine. So I thank Dr. Charron for taking the mic first. I would like to make a couple of comments, though. So with regards to the search and rescue, right, D&D is not the lead for search and rescue in Canada, right? That's a whole other thing. So we are the lead, for air search and rescue. But the Coast Guard is the lead for maritime search and rescue. When it comes to ground search and rescue, that's really a provincial responsibility. Yes, in the Arctic, our rangers, or actually really even not just in the Arctic, let's go in northern Ontario, northern New Brunswick, the rangers help out with that routinely. The RCMP will call them up, or the SQ will call them up, and the rangers will help. But it is not D&D's lead. So with regards to where, and I'm obviously not a STAR person, but they sit 10 feet away from me at CJOC. And we have this discussion is had almost annually about where the military, where the government of Canada allocates their, or puts their STAR resources, right? It's Victoria on the west coast, Halifax on the east coast, and Trenton is our central region, which is primarily responsible for the Arctic. And when they look at the statistics for search and rescue calls, 95% of those calls are all, you know, in the south, right, along the Canada-U.S. border in the southern climates. Very, very little of it is actually up in the Arctic. And so the number crunchers, the ops research analysts and that have decided thus far that it is not, sorry, I guess there are better places to allocate the resources. I'm not going to say it's not economically feasible. I'm not going to make any of those comments that's outside of my lanes, but just say they've done the numbers, and so the resources are allocated in, you know, according to where the greatest threats are and where the most number of calls are. And with regards to Nisivik, I'm not sure if they have a runway there. I know right now it's a couple of fuel bladders, and that'll become a whole of government refueling container, or refueling port. But I will say that NORAD and Canada are currently doing this, the northern basing study that's being done right now. So as Canada and the U.S. look at updating the northern warning system, which is again primarily a NORAD responsibility, they are and have been doing a study on, again, forward logistics sustainment and forward operating bases for, again, CF-18 or even whatever the Americans use these days for aircraft, though, for NORAD. So basing in that is being also looked at, and Arctic infrastructure is being looked at from a Canada and U.S. perspective on that, and we'll have to see what comes out of that for that increased, I'll say, footprint in the Arctic.
And, sorry, I just wanted the gentleman made the comment about having a commendation for operating an alert, which is an intelligence interception station. But I think he's hit on a wider issue there. It has always puzzled me why you don't get commendations for defense of Canada or for doing things in Canada. You always get recognition for doing things away from Canada. And maybe we've got it right when it comes to the alert. Now, I'm sure part of the reason for that is because it is a really difficult sell. Go for 6 months, and it could be perpetual sunlight or perpetual darkness at the very, very tip of Canada. Difficult to get out there. They've got excellent food and services, but it is a hardship. It's different from saying, guess what, you have to go to the new headquarters in Canada. It's it's a whole other ball of wax. But maybe that's an opportunity for a wider discussion about why is it we don't recognize via medals and commendations more of what Canadian soldiers do in Canada, because arguably when it comes to our defense priorities, it is Canada first, then North America and the rest of the world. Maybe we need to start recognizing the Canada part.
Thank you. Don't disagree. Actually, having served 3 postings in NDHQ, I think I'd rather have work. We're almost back on schedule, Dan, but this has been such so much information and so thought-provoking. Shall we take one more question? Yeah. So there was someone that had another question?
Thank you very much. I had sort of a short question, but now maybe I'll just add a longer comment. The first presentation, that heat map was really interesting, and I would be, if you are able to share with us, I would be very interested in, I mean, it seemed to me that the biggest threat is the one we don't know about, or rather, we have evidence that there is stuff there. So I was wondering whether there was any information about the scale of that threat, like how many, do we know broadly how many marine vessels are going through that Arctic where we are hearing signs of presence. So what is the scale of that? I also found it extremely interesting just how far out things like permafrost thaw and what I think anybody reading the headlines would regard as the larger threat, which is just what change is going to do in our Arctic. And so then I come to my kind of larger comment, and should start by saying thank you very much. Those are really fascinating presentations. And speaking as somebody who works on the environmental, economic, social side of International Arctic, I'm really delighted to hear how frequently you attach importance to an integrated and holistic approach, breaking down the barriers and seeing those opportunities. I've just come recently from St. Petersburg, where I attended the conference hosted by the Russians called Territory of Dialogue. And as I was telling Whitney Lackenbauer, that was fascinating for a whole bunch of reasons. But one of the things that came out very, very clearly in it is the Russians have a plan for their Arctic. They are looking out 30 years, and they're saying, we want our Arctic to be a key driver of our prosperity, and we are investing in that so that we'll control it, we will know what's happening, and we will have the capacity to basically commercially exploit it. So I think when we talk about Arctic sovereignty and talk about Canada's Arctic, I don't know that I think we're trying, but I'm not sure that we've gotten a sense of, when we look out 30 or 40 years, to the extent that we can say, what do we want our Arctic to be? We actually don't really have a clear sense of that. I should be very clear, do not for a second suggest that our Arctic should ever be 10% of our GDP, or, that it would be ever anything like the Russian. But I do think that we need to have more thought given to, okay, well, what is it in 40 years? What is it? Where does the Arctic fit into our national story? So that's more of a commentary than a question, but would be interested in any perspectives you have on that, and interested in any more information you're able to share about that very hot threat we have. Thank you.
So yes, I can share the heat map. Like I said, I just got that email. Let's take a look at it. From a Canadian perspective, I can't even begin to tell you what it is we don't know. I mean, because the issue is that information sharing, kind of getting all of the departments sharing the information. Right now, the Canadian heat map is 8 dots that I can put on a map and say, in the last 5 years of doing this job, these are the 8 things that I'm tracking. It's now trying to get that information from Coast Guard and DFO or from wherever, right? Again, as I was talking about federal, state, provincial, local, tribal, territorial partners, right? And that fiscal tip, trying to get the information from those entities. So next week I'm up in Yellowknife for the Arctic Security Working Group, and then Northern Interdepartmental Intelligence Working Group, where again, I will talk about this same thing and say, hey, we need this information so we can start to create a Canadian heat map. I've already had a discussion with the MSOC partners through a few groups, and Transport Canada is apparently doing this sort of thing in the Great Lakes, which is fantastic, but now we need to move that to the Arctic. And I think part of the problem, you were talking about Russia and how they have a plan 40 years out. I would suggest that's because they've got this unity of vision for what they want. And I would suggest, Mike Bielby speaking here, not D&D, we in the government of Canada maybe don't have that unity of vision. When we talk about vessels of interest as a start state. And so Privy Council Office has the Arctic Intelligence Collection Group that they co-chair with Canadian Forces Intelligence Command. And so there was a question, and it really came out of the academic OFI running aground last year, and it being a vessel of interest and how it was categorized as a vessel of interest. So the question from PCO and the AICG was, well, how does that process work in Canada? And between the 6 departments, or, well, again, 5 departments, but Coast Guard and CBSA, Coast Guard and DFO, I'm counting as 2. The fact of the matter is we don't have a unified process for the designation of vessels of interest. D&D may designate a vessel to be a national security threat. Coast Guard may well, let's look at vessels engaged in scientific research, right? So Coast Guard, DFO, fisheries, somebody may say, okay, that's a 3 Foxtrot. It's a regulatory vessel of interest because of marine scientific research. D&D may call it a 1 Delta, national security threat, potential military intelligence collector, because that research that they're doing on whatever it is could also have a dual purpose, be used for the military. So when you've got 6 departments, everybody can interpret it their own way, and no one department can supersede the other, then, if something as simple as vessels of interest can't reach a unity of vision, a unity of position, then how are we going to have that, again, at something, at the strategic level when we're talking about the Arctic? So, and again, then we add in the U.S. side of the house, where the Americans will say, well, great, you think it's X, we're going to call it Y. Then that creates a whole new issue when we're trying to look at this from a can-U.S. perspective in the Arctic. So I don't know there's no easy answer to what the Arctic's going to look in 30 to 40 years, because we can't figure out what that vessel over there looks like next week.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Like, when you think of what Canada has done in the Arctic, we created the Arctic Council. We saw a vision. We're very good at bringing people together. We need an international criminal court. Let's help draft the Rome Statute, bring everybody together. Let's do it. We need a Canada-U.S. free trade agreement. We need the smart border. Canada is known as the preeminent public servants because we have a plan. We get out in front. We pull everybody in, and it's exceptionally well run. But when it comes to our Arctic, for some reason we go into, they're going to take it away from us, and we got to defend it, and we lose all of that expertise we have in a truly Canadian dialogue. That I think we all maybe need to get a couple of psychologists to come in and give us a session so that we can get rid of that. I think it would help for truth and reconciliation. It would help with moving the country forward. It would change. We need to change the language in the conversation.
I guess I'll just add on just a couple points, is that I think I would agree that Russia has a very clear strategic vision, which is, it's not just tied to their Arctic, it's tied to how Russia, and again we use these terms Russia, but we really mean this very authoritarian government under Putin, views what the world's going to look like in 50 years. Very resource scarce, and ownership is going to mean a lot. And Russia just so happens really benefit from existing international agreements and norms, so they don't really need to be super aggressive in the Arctic to kind of achieve these economic aims. But I think in the Canadian context, I think also, again, it's the orientation of the region and its connection to the wider part of the country. I think Russia has a far more integrated view and relationship with their north that Canada doesn't have. The other thing is that the nature of that government allows for singularity of visions, right? This is a nepotistic government which has taken over almost all aspects of society that really matter in terms of achieving this vision in terms of economic and military actors. And I think that for Canada, we always want to be careful about whose voices get to participate in this idea of what the North is and who gets to be involved in these conversations. And I think what we've seen is in terms of policy is that we always see generally the same points about sovereignty is important, environmental awareness and pollution control and climate change are important, building strong communities are important, and Indigenous relations. And I think that people are trying to say, well, there needs to be an ordering to this. We need to know which one goes first or how they're tethered. And I think that is a very complicated issue in and of itself because of the actors that are going to be involved in that. And also, are we really going to kind of create this kind of pyramid of which one is more important? And the other thing I'll say about Canada's Arctic is, like, to use defense for an interesting example, is that the Arctic intersects its 3 domains in terms of defense of Canada, defense of North America, and defense of the western part of the world. And so it's very difficult because you can't think of a strategy for the Canadian Arctic without thinking about the regional Arctic, the Russian Arctic, the Arctic in 2050. And I think that is where the real challenge is going to evolve. It's not so much about the Arctic of now, but in 50 years when there is transnational shipping routes and things like that, how are we going to think about operating in that space and with who and to what degree? And I think that strategic level thinking has really fallen off. Not because I think of necessary laziness, but because we're so involved in the process about who gets involved in terms of communities, territories, private industry. And those are all very important questions that maybe Russia doesn't necessarily need to think about as much as Canada because of our difference of governance systems and values and stuff like that.
And
You guys are so easy to work with. It was a real pleasure just even getting to know you as short time I had. So thank you very much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now and thank you for joining us.